Well, here we are, key concept 8.1, which very succinctly put is about the Cold War. This time period 8 is 1945 to 1980. So we have a 35-year time period. And our first key concept is going to deal with, as you can see here with the language, primarily trying to figure out what the United States' role in the world is going to be. After World War II, the post-war world is kind of stabilized by the United States and the Soviet Union, creating this bipolar world, communism versus capitalism, totalitarianism versus democracy. And the United States, after World War II, is very clearly the most powerful country in the world, only rivaled by the Soviet Union. And so how does the United States respond to this? This is a new role for the United States. And that's what key concept 8.1 is really focused on. We have 4 big idea questions here. First, what factors led to the Cold War in the immediate aftermath of World War II? We're going to spend a decent amount of time talking about this in class, so I'm not going to talk too much about it in the lecture. Suffice it to say, the United States and the Soviet Union have always had a tense relationship. And after the war, the United States and the Soviet Union have goals that don't always align, and more often than not don't align. And so that's the primary factor, but of course we're going to get into the minutiae of that more in class. Second, what were the different ways the U.S. sought to contain communism both domestically and abroad? I often tell students that this is in some ways a simple key concept for them to understand because it's about U.S. foreign policy between 1945 and 1980. And U.S. foreign policy during that time period can usually be summed up in one word, and that is containment. The United States is trying to contain the spread of communism, and most of its actions post-World War II can be explained by containment. Why do we get involved in Korea? Containment. Why are we meddling in Latin American affairs? Containment. Why are we getting involved in Vietnam? Containment. Why are we propping up dictators? Containment. You get the idea. Third, how did independence movements throughout the world affect the Cold War? World War II also ends the period of colonialism or imperialism for good. It's going to take some time. There are colonies that don't get their independence until the 1960s, but that process is going to accelerate rapidly after World War II. So now you have all of these countries, these third world countries, which they're called at the time, which the United States and the Soviet Union are vying for influence over. And some of these countries are like really big, like India recently gets its independence in the late 1940s. Who are they going to align more closely with is an important question for the United States. And fourth, how did the Cold War impact domestic life? We'll talk about this somewhat in key concept 8.2 as well, but most of it is housed in this key concept. So Roman numeral 1. United States policymakers engaged in a Cold War with the authoritarian Soviet Union, seeking to limit the growth of communist military power and ideological influence, create a free market global economy, and build an international security system. I want you to think about these 2 words here, this phrase, Cold War. It's called a Cold War because the United States and the Soviet Union never directly confront each other from 1945 all the way until the dissolution of the Soviet Union in the early 1990s. But this was not always a given. It was called the Cold War at the time, but there were some people who were worried that the war was going to get hot. The Cuban Missile Crisis is probably the closest that the 2 countries come to a direct conflict, and thankfully that was peacefully resolved after 13 days. But yeah, so Cold War, why is it called the Cold War? It's because there was never a war between the 2 superpowers. But as we'll see, there were a number of proxy wars or proxy conflicts that were fought in the name of either the United States or the Soviet Union or communism or democracy. So we shouldn't forget that the United States and the Soviet Union were allies during the war, and the Soviet Union was allied with Britain and France and Belgium and the Netherlands and all these other countries that were fighting the Axis powers. That falls apart quickly, and it's very clear towards the end of the war that it is going to fall apart quickly because the Soviets have different goals than the rest of the Allies. Primarily, the Soviets are worried about protecting their borders and also just protecting themselves from what they see as the surrounding capitalist world. And so these post-war conferences, which we'll talk about in class, Yalta and Potsdam being the two big ones, are really tense because the Allies have, in some ways, ganged up on the Soviet Union, and the Soviets don't really take too kindly to that. And plus, the Soviets see themselves as embattled not just against like the Germans, because the German threat is pretty much gone. Now they see themselves embattled against the entire West, capital W. So the U.S. is going to develop a foreign policy around this. What is the United States going to do about the Soviet Union and its influence? The United States has three answers to this. The first answer is collective security. So the United States, for the first time since the Revolutionary War, is going to enter into a military alliance with European countries, and that is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which is signed in 1949 and still exists today. NATO is a big step for the United States, of course, because since it's a military alliance, NATO means that an attack on one country was an attack on all countries. Remember, if you think back to World War I, the United States wanted to stay out of that war and managed to for quite a while, got involved, and then said, we're done with you, to Europe. And then the United States stayed out of World War II in Europe for over 2 years. Unlike after World War I, we didn't say we're done with you. The United States finally came to realize that the only solution long-term is for it to be directly involved in European affairs. It's a big step for the United States, and it's a big reversal of the ideology that's inherent in George Washington's farewell address. The second way the United States is going to try to develop a foreign policy around, I should just say develop foreign policy after World War II, is through international aid. Again, very active. This is direct involvement by the United States in the rebuilding of Europe. The Marshall Plan, which becomes government policy in 1947, provides billions of dollars to Europe to rebuild war-torn countries. Contrast this with after World War I, when the United States says, yeah, a lot of destruction, sorry about that, but we did our part and we're not going to help. The Marshall Plan provides billions of dollars to European countries to rebuild. And we're not just talking about the countries that the United States was on the same side as in the war. We're not just talking about Britain and France or Belgium or the Netherlands. We're also talking about Germany and Italy. So these countries that the United States spent years trying to destroy, the United States is going to quickly turn around and try to rebuild them. Why are they going to do this? The Soviet threat and the threat of the spread of communism. If these countries in Europe are not rebuilt, the fertile ground for communism in the United States can't have that. Truman Doctrine I'll talk a little bit more about in a moment, because the Truman Doctrine fits really well under containment. And in fact, the Truman Doctrine is the classic example of when the United States really commits itself to containing the spread of communism in the United States. Congress authorizes $400 million in military aid to Greece and Turkey, these two countries that were fighting the spread of communism. I say that with air quotes around it because both of these conflicts are a little more complex than that. But the United States saw them as clear-cut, that there were freedom fighters who were fighting for democracy and freedom, and they were fighting against the horrible, godless communists. And Truman makes this really famous speech in front of Congress where he says, we have to support the free peoples of the world. And there you go, there's containment. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. Third, the United States is also going to inject itself into creating and maintaining economic institutions that are bolstering non-communist nations. The International Monetary Fund is the best example of this, another organization like NATO that's still around today. And the IMF provides loans to countries in need and also promotes trade. IMF is not without controversy. There are some people who argue that the IMF is a way for the first world countries, the developed countries of the world, to exert their will and influence over the poorer countries, the third world countries, the underdeveloped countries of the world. But at the time, the United States saw this as an important tool to doing what? Containing the spread of communism. Which brings us here. The United States contained communism through things like the Truman Doctrine, which I talked about before. This is another big departure for the United States, where the United States is saying we have to support financially. $400 million in 1947 is not exactly chump change, we have to support financially these civil wars. We have to support one side of this civil war halfway around the world. Once the United States determines that that is the policy that they need to follow, containment is the logical outcome to that. If you're going to support freedom fighters in Greece and Turkey because you're worried about the spread of communism, then you're going to have to do it all over the world. And this is the crux of containment. It sounds great. We're going to support people who want freedom and democracy and capitalism. But in practice, it's really hard to do because you have to accurately identify who those people are. You have to figure out a way to help those people, and you have to do it all over the world. And that's really tough. The two best examples of this are the Korean War and the Vietnam War. These are the two wars that the United States is going to fight during this time period, 1945 to 1980. Both of them are not declared wars. In fact, the last declared war that the United States fought was World War II, and that's true today. Korea and Vietnam are both police actions, in a sense. They are left up to the president, and the president acting through NATO and the United Nations. So why do we get involved? Well, it's containment, but there's also an addendum to containment, which is the domino theory. The domino theory is another popular theory during this time, more 1950s, early 1960s. It's the belief that if one country becomes communist, then the surrounding countries would fall to communism as well. The idea that communism spreads easily through adjacent areas. This should make sense. If you look at a map, we see China becomes communist in 1949. Well, why did China become communist in 1949? Americans say, well, because it's adjacent to the Soviet Union. What's happening to North Korea in 1950? Looking like it's communist, being supported by China. And then the North invades the South. Oh, look, communism is spreading. And we see the same thing, the same line of thinking in Vietnam. So the domino theory is an important theory when you're talking about the 1950s and 1960s mentality of U.S. foreign policy. So we have the Truman Doctrine, we have military engagements, and also threats. The United States is going to make threats to anyone who it sees as a problem. And these threats are based on massive retaliation, the idea that the United States would respond with more force, and the United States could make this threat. The United States was the only atomic power until 1949. And even then, throughout the 1950s, the United States remained probably the strongest country in the world militarily. The Soviet Union, by the time you get to the late 1950s, can make the claim that it is passing the United States in some ways, maybe in terms of military technology or maybe in terms of space technology. And Americans were really afraid of that in the late 1950s and 1960s. But when historians look back on it and really look closely at it, the Soviet Union was never as powerful militarily as the United States was during the time period. And while both countries, by the time you get to the 1960s, possessed the ability to destroy each other, this threat of massive retaliation was still something that the United States liked to use. We'll watch a video in class right before winter break, which is going to put a different perspective on the threat of massive retaliation. Last, kind of ideological conflicts, I guess we could put the space race under. But the space race is kicked off in 1957 when the Soviet Union launches this thing, Sputnik, which is it's a satellite that's like the size of a basketball, and it didn't do anything. They launched it up into orbit, it orbited around the Earth, but it scared the hell out of America because what it did do, you could see it. You could look up in the night sky and you could see it going across the sky. And it also emitted a beep that you could hear on the radio. You could tune your radio to actually hear Sputnik. And so Americans had all these ideas in their brains. What if the Soviets are spying on us from space? And what if they can launch satellites with missiles on them and lasers and all this kind of stuff? This is like the golden age of science fiction as well, and you can understand why. Because Americans are turning their sights to the skies and they don't really like what they see. And then you couple that with Yuri Gagarin, who was the first man in space, and it seems that the Soviets are starting to jump ahead of the United States by the time you get to the early 1960s. And so the United States commits itself to building up a robust space program, making it to the moon before the Soviets, which we do in 1969. We are still the only country to have ever visited the moon, and we did so on multiple occasions. But a broader impact to this is the effect that this had on the American education system. STEM programs, science, technology, engineering, mathematics. We pour a lot of money into these programs from the 1960s onward. We're still very much in that vein today. No comment from the history teacher. As you kind of seen already, I'll fly through this one, but the Cold War fluctuated between direct and indirect military confrontation. So a good example of an indirect military confrontation would be the Cuban Missile Crisis, where we discover that the Soviet Union has placed missiles in Cuba. You can see some of these silos here on their side, some trucks here. This picture was taken by an American U-2 spy plane over Cuba. And so we find these pictures and oh man, the Soviet Union's putting missiles in Cuba 90 miles off the coast of Florida. These could be nuclear missiles. Now they're 90 miles off the coast of the United States. And so we blockade Cuba. We threaten war with the Soviet Union. Soviet Union sends their entire Baltic fleet steaming towards the United States, and for 13 days in October of 1962, it looks like the Cold War is finally going to become hot. This is the tensest moment of the Cold War. Americans every day are turning their televisions on at night to listen to the news and wondering if it's going to be another war, this one even worse than World War II. Thankfully, war was averted when the Soviets agreed to remove their missiles from Cuba, while we agreed to not invade Cuba, because we'd kind of done that before in 1961, and we also agreed to remove our nuclear missiles from Turkey, which were right on the border of the Soviet Union. So you have these really tense moments of indirect military confrontation, and we have really tense moments of direct military confrontation, at least in terms of proxy wars like Korea or Vietnam or the Soviets fighting in Afghanistan. But we also have these periods during the Cold War of détente. Détente means an easing or cooling of tensions between the superpowers. So after the Cuban Missile Crisis is a good example. We get this really tense, really close to war. And then afterwards, both sides realize, oh, we can't have a war between each other. This would just be really bad. And so they seek to ease the tensions by installing something that's called the hotline, which is a direct phone line between the White House and the Kremlin in the Soviet Union. Because one of the problems with the Cuban Missile Crisis is that Kennedy and Nikita Khrushchev, the leader of the Soviet Union, couldn't easily talk to each other. Another period of détente in the early 1970s when Richard Nixon visits China and the Soviet Union. First American president to ever visit the Soviet Union. This helps to cool tensions off a little bit as well. And in time period 9, we'll talk in the 1980s about détente in the mid-1980s when Mikhail Gorbachev, the leader of the Soviet Union, the premier of the Soviet Union, starts to issue reforms, and that leads to another period of détente. So you can view the Cold War as this kind of seesaw event, or maybe just waves going up and down. There are times of heightened tension. There are also times of détente. Strategic arms limitation talks and SALT treaties are an example of this, which began with Nixon's administration and continued through Carter's. So that's Gerald Ford and Jimmy Carter. So this is all the 1970s, where the United States and the Soviet Union is getting together for a series of talks, and they're talking about, all right, how can we make sure that a war doesn't happen between us? Do we really need all of these nuclear missiles? We'll get rid of these if you get rid of these, etc., etc. So an agreement to limit certain arms there. So I mentioned this at the outset in the big idea questions, but these post-war decolonization movements in Asia, Africa, and the Middle East are important context for the Cold War. Sorry, I had to pause it there for a second. So this is important context for the Cold War because the United States and the Soviet Union are seeking allies, and this is viewed as a zero-sum game by both of these countries, meaning that if one country is an ally of the United States, that is another country that is an enemy of the Soviet Union, and vice versa. And both countries are looking at the world map and they're seeing so much opportunity out there. All these places that are becoming free and independent states, I should say independent states in Africa, in Southeast Asia, its former colonies of the Europeans, are now all up for grabs. And this leads to conflict. Israel's a good example of this because there's still conflict over Israel, though it's not in the guise of the Cold War. But Israel was declared in 1948. The United States immediately recognized Israel. And so that's going to create tension in the Middle East, again, still to this day, but throughout the Cold War as well. Many revolutions throughout the world are seen as pawns of the Soviet Union. The United States, itself a country born out of revolution, no longer sees revolution as a good thing throughout the world. Every revolution is tinged with red as far as the United States are concerned. There is clearly communists who are trying to subvert the normal fabric of international relations by creating these revolutions. So Vietnam is the best example of this because Vietnam is pretty much a nationalist revolution, but the United States doesn't see it that way. The United States sees it as a communist revolution that's being influenced by China. Latin America during the 1970s, another great example of this too, which brings me to the Cold War in Latin America. I love this quote from the College Board curriculum. The United States supported non-communist regimes with varying levels of commitment to democracy. So what does that mean? It means that the United States is not really concerned about democracy in the context of the Cold War. Any government that is not communist is a good government as far as the United States is concerned. So 1954, this is an example of what I was just talking about here, right? Arbenz in Guatemala. We as a country are really worried about Arbenz. He's pretty left-leaning. Again, at the time, to be really liberal and left-leaning is a bad thing because it means you're closer to communism on the spectrum. And so what do? We help to overthrow Arbenz. He was democratically elected, but, he was taking over land that was owned by the United Fruit Company, and this was a United States corporation. You're nationalizing land from a corporation. This sounds like communism. And so the United States says we cannot allow this to stand. And so we helped to orchestrate his ouster, his overthrow, and he was replaced by a military dictator. And that's okay as far as the United States is concerned in the context of the Cold War, because the only thing that matters is not communist. We'll do a reading in class from a historian named Stephen Rabe from his book that's called The Killing Zone. I may have mentioned it already before. And it's really going to get into a lot of these issues throughout the 1960s and 70s in Latin America. The United States isn't just doing this in Latin America. It's doing it all over the world. But it's really easy for the United States to do this in Latin America just because of our geographic location. All right, on to Roman numeral 2. This is a little bit shorter than Roman numeral 1. I know I'm talking a lot in this because I love the Cold War, but I promise I'll try to keep this somewhere around 30 minutes. Cold War policies led to public debates over power federal government, acceptable means of pursuing international and domestic goals, while at the same time protecting civil liberties. The Cold War, especially during the 1950s, is really not a great time for civil liberties. How are you going to root out communists? Well, we've already taken a look at how the United States is trying to root out communism around the world. How is the United States trying to do it at home? Well, a lot of the measures are not really putting freedom first. Executive Order 9835, which is known as Truman's Loyalty Oath. Federal employees have to sign a loyalty oath to the United States government. Now, on the face of it, it's not really a big deal. But at the same time, it sort of flies in the face of things like freedom of speech. That's kind of important in American lore. It's like the First Amendment, number 1. And not surprisingly, we also get a second Red Scare at the time. We had the first Red Scare right after the Communist Revolution in 1917. The second Red Scare is probably worse in some ways. The first Red Scare is really bad if you're an immigrant. The first Red Scare is really bad, certainly if you're a communist, although there aren't too many of those in the United States at the time. The second Red Scare is affecting a broader swath of American culture and American citizens. HUAC, which stands for the House Un-American Activities Committee, which has actually been around prior to World War II, and these are some of the members of the Hollywood 10, are examples of the Second Red Scare. And often when people think of the Second Red Scare, they think of this guy, Joseph McCarthy, who is the junior senator from the state of Wisconsin. We're going to talk a ton about this in class, so I won't belabor the point because I could go on and on and on about this. I should say, just to backtrack a moment, the Hollywood 10 are 10, I think they're all actors. They're all certainly Hollywood types. I don't know if there were directors or producers in there, but they're 10 people from Hollywood who refused to testify and to name names, because what HUAC, the House Un-American Activities Committee, is doing at the time is they are trying to weed out communist influence in the United States by bringing people in front of the House Un-American Activities Committee and grilling them on their beliefs, but also the beliefs of the people who are around them. And Hollywood is a top target at the time. These 10 refuse to name names, they refuse to testify, and they are blacklisted from Hollywood, meaning they can never work in Hollywood again. And we'll talk about McCarthyism and his tactics in class. He's a very similar figure to, if you think back to world history, very similar figure to Maximilien Robespierre in some ways. So we'll draw that parallel in class. Important note, both political parties during this time period supported containing the threat of communism. That's the paradigm that the United States government exists in, especially during the 40s, after World War II, 50s, 60s, and early 70s, really 1950s and 1960s. Eisenhower, Truman, both of these wars, the two proxy wars that the United States fights during the Cold War, Korea and Vietnam, are both initiated and led by Democratic presidents, Truman in Korea, and actually JFK gets us involved in Vietnam before LBJ really turns it into a full-scale war. Now, that's not to say that the Cold War was popular with all Americans, and we do see dissent, and the dissent is building throughout the 1950s and into the 1960s. At first, there's very little dissent. After World War II, the United States initiates the Korean War in summer of 1950. When North Koreans invade the South Koreans, the United States goes to prop up South Korea, and that is a popular war for the most part. Only minor opposition. It's a small war. It's a limited war, especially compared to World War II. But the Korean War doesn't lead to this glorious victory for the United States, and that's what the United States had gotten used to after World War I and World War II. So it does create some minor opposition, and it really creates some questions after the war. We don't manage to topple North Korea. North Korea continues to exist. So is this war a success? The Vietnam War sees violent protests, and they increase as the war goes on, especially after the Tet Offensive in January of 1968. Sorry, hopefully last interruption. So let's talk about the Tet Offensive, January 1968. The war was sort of popular. 1966, 1967, there was dissent. But as the war dragged on and it became less and less clear that the United States was going to win, the opposition built. Students for a Democratic Society are a good example of this. They used violence as time went on to protest, and you start dragging on into the late 1960s and early 1970s, and you see things like Kent State, which is a college in Ohio. There's student protests. National Guard is called out, and 4 students are killed in the protest. Is a Pulitzer Prize winning photo of one of the students who had just been shot by the National Guard. You know, this is the stuff that a lot of people from this generation remember about the Vietnam War, and this is one of the reasons why the Vietnam War has such a troublesome and problematic legacy in our country. There's so much pain around Vietnam, not just the war itself and for the veterans who had to experience this horrible war, but also for the people at home who saw this nation that had been so unified during World War II ripped apart by a war afterwards. So, Americans are debating a lot during the Cold War. The merits of a large nuclear arsenal. Of course, Americans are debating. The military-industrial complex, which is the buildup of military and industries throughout the United States. Prior to World War I, the United States barely had a standing army. And now, all of a sudden, you get to the 1950s, and the United States has a massive global presence. The United States has a permanent infrastructure for maintaining this massive global presence. And this is the country we live in today. And this is often referred to as the military-industrial complex. Eisenhower warns about this in what is considered a pretty famous farewell address for a president. You get to hear the announcements. Isn't this nice? This is why I usually record these at home. Although then you just hear my dog bark, so I guess that's probably better, though. If we get time, we'll try to read through Eisenhower's farewell address here. But Eisenhower, of course, was a general. He was a leader of the invasion of Normandy on D-Day, so he knows the military very, very well. He's a 5-star general, I think. I think he was our last 5-star general. Don't quote me on that. In his farewell address, the last address he has to the American people, he chooses to focus on how problematic and worrisome this buildup of the military-industrial complex was. Eisenhower was born in the late 1800s. You know, he was born into a country that had like militias and didn't have a standing army. And he's leaving office presiding over the largest peacetime military buildup in the history of the United States. And he's really worried about that. And sort of related to that is the power of the executive branch in foreign and military policy. I mentioned before that both Korea and Vietnam are police actions. These are not declared wars. Should the president have the power to wage a war? Originally, Congress gave Lyndon Baines Johnson in 1964 the power to do this with the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. That was rolled back 9 years later with the War Powers Act in 1973. We'll take a look at that in class. Last, it's important that we talk about the Middle East for this time period because obviously a lot of our recent history has been tied up with the Middle East. And some of the roots of what's going on in the Middle East today can be seen during the Cold War.
Dallas DiNardo, please come get your Chromebook from the main office. Dallas DiNardo, please come get your Chromebook from the main office. You left it in the art room. Thank you.
Can't leave it in the art room. Bad place to leave it. So how is the United States getting involved here? Suez Crisis, which we might talk about only briefly. I think it's mentioned in your textbook. Egypt nationalizes the Suez Canal. Suez Canal had been controlled by the British, built by the French, controlled by the British. And Egypt said, yeah, but this is in Egypt, so we're going to take control of it. And the British and French invaded Egypt. And the United States was really upset because we were worried that it was going to give the Soviet Union an excuse to get involved in the region. The Suez Canal is super important for trade. The big one here are the oil crises. Not surprisingly, when you're talking about the Middle East, you have to talk about oil. These oil crises throughout the 1970s, led by OPEC, which is a cartel that's formed by mostly Middle Eastern countries, Venezuela's in there as well, to control the supply of oil. OPEC, multiple times throughout the Cold War, uses its power over the control of oil to try to exert its influence on the United States foreign policy, often because of Israel and our support for Israel. So the example that I put on the slide, after the United States supports Israel in the Yom Kippur War of 1973, there's an oil embargo, drastically raised gas prices. We had gas rationing. You can, if some of your parents might remember this if they were alive at the time, but long lines at gas stations, it really scared America because we had come to see ourselves as the most powerful country in the world, and yet here are these Middle Eastern countries that are holding us hostage. So yeah, this is a great unit, and this is a great time period. And I can't stress enough the importance of kind of these two first bullet points here, right? If you know anything coming out of this time period, you should know containment, how the United States is attempting to contain the spread of communism. You should understand the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan as the two ways post-World War II that the United States is trying to do this. And then certainly the Korean War and the Vietnam War and how they fit into this idea of containment and containing the spread of communism. Détente, which we talked about, these periods of the easing or cooling of tensions, and the military-industrial complex is often something that is asked about on the exam, and because these this idea, the military-industrial complex, still resonates today. And Eisenhower's farewell address is so famous. I've seen it on a couple exams. So that's a good one. Essay questions. World War II is a turning point, obviously. Comparing and contrasting post-World War I and post-World War II, obviously. I mean, these are really classic essay questions for the College Board just because they're obvious historically in some ways, and they allow students to write about a number of different aspects of history. Whew. All right, a little longer than last time. Sorry, I'm going to blame it on the announcements. Hope you got something out of it. See you in class.